Hey everybody, welcome back to Me, Myself, and I. Trevor here. Very, very special guest today, Kelsey Dionne of the Arcane Library and creator of Shadowdark. Hello, Kelsey. How are you?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, but of course, as you know, I told you before we started recording, I'm on the new, well, it's not new, it's new to me, the new Riverside podcast app, and I'm not sponsored. This is just I bought it, but I'm testing to see if this works, and if it does, then I'll maybe use it in the future, and if not, I'll go back to my old weird arcane. Haha, arcane. See what I did there? Arcane way of. The reason why I'm doing this is because I did an interview with Ben Milton not too long ago, but he had some tech issues on his end, and so consequently, I had to use his Zoom camera angle for the interview. So in that interview, I look all pristine, but he looks like he's seeing up his nose because the camera was low angle. So I was like, well, let's not do that for Kelsey. Let's see if we can get something a little better. So I'm hoping that this works. But anyway, enough about that. Thanks for joining me. For those of you, or for those of the viewers who for some reason don't know who you are, just give us a little quick intro as to who you are and yada, yada, yada.
Yeah, Kelsey Dionne. I run a little company called the Arcane Library. Used to publish a lot of third-party 5e material, but about earlier this year, I released a game called Shadowdark RPG, which is kind of like an old school D&D game that tries to take some modernized game design and apply it to the old ways. And so that's what I am now probably most known for is that game.
Yeah, and you had this tremendously successful Kickstarter, which you did earlier this year, and I actually met you for the first time at Gen Con in August. I guess that was August,
Right.
and that was such a great time. It was so great to meet you and Professor Dungeon Master and Ben Milton and Baron Durop and all of these people that I've been watching. And there you all were in the flesh, and it was just such a cool experience for me. So
Oh yeah, it
I
was
thought
magical.
yeah, it kind of was. It kind of was. So I thought I'd, delve a little deeper into these into guests' lives and experiences and gaming stories and stuff. So that's really all this is about. So before we begin, I want to talk about something because Shadowdark is, as you say, based on sort of the old ways of doing things. So would you call it a rules light game?
That is something people actually argue about all the time on the internet. I'm so curious. I would actually not call it that personally. I would call it an attempt to be very streamlined and elegant with the rule systems it has, but there's a fair amount of complexity to some of the processes that the game uses. So I would maybe call it like a rules medium game if I'm allowed to make up a term there, because like I feel like at the far end of the spectrum, you might have something like Cairn that's just so sleek and it has like just a couple things that it's just doing so well. And then far on the other side, you have something like fifth edition, and I land somewhere between those two, I would say.
That's interesting. Professor Dungeon Master just released a video. I don't know if you saw it. Saying it was something like why I like rules like games or something. Have you seen that video?
I have, yeah, and I love his take on it. He's very much at this like not he doesn't want to be hindered by having to look things up, and I'm on board with that. I think I lean more in that direction than I do towards the other side.
Yeah, that's understandable, and I completely see that side of things. But I found myself, and it was funny because when I interviewed him at Gen Con, we had this conversation about system complexity, and he called dice just a series of math rocks, just a way to get to whether or not the character succeeds at something. And I totally understand and respect that viewpoint. However, when he released his video, every part of me was screaming like, but, because what he says in the video is, I like rules light because all I need at the end of the day is to know whether or not the character succeeds at something. So the less complexity between the initiation of that action and the outcome of that action, those aren't his words, those are my words, but the less sort of gunk in between those two things, the better, and that I can get on with it. So he talks about things like, my players have no problem if they say, well, I want to jump this chasm, and I say, roll an 8 or more, and they're fine with that. And the rules guy in me was screaming against this. Not because I disagree with him, because I don't. I totally understand what he's saying. But to me, to say that rules like that, all you need to do is the end result. That's all anybody really cares about. That's a bit like saying, well, you know, when you go to a restaurant, you might as well just order the gruel, because in the end, food is just about the sustenance. All we need the food for is the sustenance. So why bother with all of the flavors and the preparation and because in the end, it's just eating, right? That's how I see it. I'm like, in cooking and in eating, so much of the joy is entirely based on the flavors and the ingredients and the different textures and the scents and the smells and all this stuff. So that's kind of my take on it. And it's also the reason why I kind of bounce off a lot of rules-light games, at least after the first couple of sessions. Because while I can completely understand and appreciate a super, super, super tight and light rule set, I still feel like I get bored of that very quickly. It's like constantly eating nothing but gruel. And eventually I'm like, I need something else on the palate here. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, I completely find that I sometimes run into that too, because there are times, it's funny that I think that fifth edition does get sort of maligned a lot just in general. It's kind of easy to like beat up on, fifth edition because it's the big dog and we're like, oh, but there are times where it is fun to play because it has a little bit more complexity to it. And there are a lot of people who like to look for, look for the ways that rules can interact and merge and kind of build these complex things out. And to them, that's one of the most fun parts of the game. And you don't always have that in a super rules like game. Like there's intentionally not a ton of interactivity between the systems because that creates complexity. And I myself sometimes like messing around with a character build that's totally wacky and like making that really crazy character just as a mental exercise. So yeah, it's not. I don't think anyone could be happy only playing rules light games forever. Because you're missing out on a side of the hobby then.
I talk with and read about a lot of these players, and Dan is Professor DM was one of them, where they've essentially played the same game for like 30 years, the same system and everything. And to me, I just think, how do you do that? Because for me, I get so excited about new games and new systems and new way of approaching things. And this is also the reason why, even if I find a rule set that I'm really, really happy with, I guarantee you I'm going to house rule it within the first few sessions, because we're always tweaking. We're always looking to make it better. And the idea of just playing the same game for years and years and years is so weird to me, but it's very common. A lot of people do it. I mean, the 5e guys, most of those people, I mean, a lot of them don't even know there are other games. This is a little pet peeve of mine, as I've mentioned many, many times on this channel. But the idea of just playing the same game over and over and over again, how does it not become like just eating the same meal, to go back to my analogy? How does it, the same meal, 3 meals a day, every day for 20 years would be like, don't you want to try something else? So I don't know. That's always been so strange to me, but I'm also the guy that's like, hey guys, I know we've been in this campaign for a year and you're really enjoying it, but I got a new shiny. Haha, let's try this now. And they're like, why? Why don't you just stick to something? So I totally understand that other viewpoint too, but
It's true though. It's funny because I worry about this all the time as a game designer. I'm like, because like when I designed something like Shadowdark, I created a game that was where my interests were most, fixated at that time in my life as a creator. And, as the years go on, I encounter new game systems. I encounter other ways of doing mechanics that I find super interesting. And I sometimes think to myself, like, is it inevitable that everyone makes like a second edition of their game system? Or because it's true that I've never stopped learning new systems and encountering new things that I like. So just because I fixed something in a state now and I say, here's a system, it doesn't mean that that's going to be the end of my interest in system design. So I wonder about that. And I'm like, sheesh, what's the right way forward on stuff like that? As a game designer, I worry. I'm like, what if everyone gets mad in 10 years if I'm like, we need Shadowdark second edition, it's time to make some changes, Yeah.
Well, it is inevitable. Of course that's going to happen. And I think you nailed it exactly as to why it happens, because game designers, just like players and just like game masters, are always learning and always tweaking and always house ruling and always trying to figure out. So if you're doing that for your own game, your own home game, why wouldn't you do that as a designer? Of course you would. You'd presumably, as a designer, you're also running your own game and you're learning new stuff from it, and you're seeing, oh, you know what, if I could go back and just tweak this, it would work a little better. So invariably there's a second edition. And not to mention the other reasons for second editions, like what Pathfinder is doing right now. They're putting out their I don't know what they're calling it, revised 2e or whatever, but that is almost entirely to get rid of the OGL stuff, right? That's more of a business decision than a design decision. But I do know that they are also taking the opportunity to try and quote unquote fix rules in what so many of my game balance obsessed friends call the perfect system.
Do they? You know, that's so funny. I've barely played it. Which is that blasphemy?
Not to me.
I did play it. Yeah, you're like, it's too far in the direction of complexity for me. So
Me too.
it's, you know, I always run into this problem. I don't know how you feel about this. I feel like a really big struggle with either as a player or when you're running a game and you're trying to make sure you can kind of corral your players or at least be sort of aware of what they can do so you're not super caught off guard. It's like build optimization is kind of like a weird religion, you know, and it's its own just like worshipped process. And
Yeah.
I get intimidated by it, actually. I find like super intense build optimization to be like really off-putting and scary, and like I feel like I'm losing control of my game when my players are like that and stuff. How do
Right.
you feel about that?
I can't stand it. I think it's I think it comes out of video games. I think that's where it comes from, because of course, as we know, video games like fantasy, like Baldur's Gate style games come out of D&D, and now they started to design D&D around the video games, and so you get this mounting complexity based on things like build. The first time that I really encountered that, I think, was D&D 3.5 or 3.0, whatever, the third edition, because the third edition was, as far as I know, and I missed second edition D&D entirely, so I'm no authority on this, but as far as I know, at least it felt this way, that third edition was the first time that build became paramount, that it was important at level 1 to know where you wanted to be at level 15, whereas before that was utterly irrelevant. And also, it was really the first time that you started to see kind of this super powered mentality in characters, where now it wasn't just about their class or anything like that. It was about their feats. It was about their special abilities that they could. And just it's a series of exception-based rules, right? Where here's the base rules, and now you have this special thing that allows you to circumvent those rules in order to maximize your advantage in a certain situation. And it kind of makes me sick, because it's like, I get it. There's a certain mindset that loves to tinker with those kind of mechanics in order to power game or whatever you want to call it. Not that there's anything wrong inherently with power gaming. There's not.
Right.
A lot of people really enjoy that part. But for me, it's just, and I'm not going to say something stupid like, but for me, it's all about this story, because no. But I don't want to obsess over every little detail of my character creation either being a trap, like I made something and now it's going to screw me later mechanically, or I just don't want to be constantly obsessing over the numbers. Honestly, one of the reasons why we gave up AD&D back in the day is because eventually, it's kind of the opposite problem. AD&D, you know, a 5th level fighter is a 5th level fighter is a 5th level fighter. In AD&D, the only thing that really distinguished those people was their stuff. Right? Well, this 5th level fighter has a +3 Vorpal weapon or whatever, and this guy has an axe of flaming stupidity or whatever the case is. So I hated that, because it was like, so these characters are all just the same except their gear is different. And so what happens? Third edition comes out basically trying to remedy that, to say it's not about the gear, it's about, and I go, nah. So I'm never happy, apparently.
Well, but that's such a good question, a good line of thinking, because I wonder about this often. Like, where is the happy medium between those two things? I think about this a lot. Like, there is a certain amount of character complexity that's satisfying, right? When to your average bear. Like, I want my character to be different enough from another 5th level fighter. But then it goes overboard. Like, third edition straight up went overboard on that stuff. Like, threw through the roof. Like it
Yeah.
was just too crazy. There were too many skills, too many weird interactions, feats and exceptions and complexity that was like you couldn't get a grip on it. So, do you have like sort of a platonic ideal of how much nuance you want with characters, where enough is enough but not too much?
Yeah, but that's because I really gravitate towards skill-based games. I'm
Hmm.
I'm sort of instinctually against class and level,
Hmm.
because, and I understand their role, I understand their function. Class is there to create niche protection for characters. I mean, you
Hmm.
obviously know this. You're a game designer. You get this. Class is there to create niche protection so that nobody feels like their toes are being stepped on. Whereas with skill-based games, something like RuneQuest, for example, you don't have that. So there could be situations where if two characters are really good at a particular skill, let's say first aid, but one of them is slightly better, well, they're always going to gravitate. You've got 5% more than that guy. You really should do the first aid, even though that other guy spent all these
Hmm.
points in getting his first aid up to 60. The other guy's got 65, so we're going to realize. So that kind of sucks for him. So that's the drawback to skill-based games, one of them. But I still prefer that because in a skill-based game, you can expand your character into whatever direction you want. You're not
Hmm.
limited by that niche protection. You're not limited by these artificial walls and boundaries around your character. Well, you're a fighter. You can never cast a spell. No, you can learn to cast a spell. Maybe you'll never be as good at it as someone who devoted their entire life to it. But that's why Rollmaster, the game Rollmaster by ICE back in the day, really kind of hit that interesting balance in a way. In Rollmaster, there was classes. However,
Hmm.
all that basically did was give you a series of costs for different types of skills. So obviously a mage, when he's learning magic, is going to be able to he's going to learn all that stuff. But if he's trying to learn how to swing a sword, he can do it. It's just going to take away resources from other things. Just same thing with a fighter. A fighter's really good at learning all the weapons. He can learn to use a spell. It's just going to it's going to be more expensive. And I love that because it still allows people to tailor their character and still retain that sense of niche protection. So it was really quite a masterstroke in terms of design. The problem with Rollmaster was that everything else was crazy complex, and it was really easy to drown in the complexity of the game. So nothing's perfect.
I remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't played it a lot. I actually Rollmaster was, I believe, the first non D&D game that
Mm.
I ever played. Um, and I remember loving how interesting and unique my character was, but I also had like a clipboard to keep track of her. She was like a wizard, a spellcaster. And I kind of remember having no idea what I was doing the entire time, and it was still fun, but I just couldn't wrap my head around a lot of stuff, and I wonder if it's because I bounced off of the character build itself being super complex, or at least to my little tiny pea brain it
No,
was.
there's a
So,
lot of people that feel that way, and a very good friend of mine, he was playing essentially a version of Rollmaster with us. This is excuse me, this is back when I was in Vancouver, and he dreaded when we would gain a level, because gain a level means now you allocate your development points into different skills, and it was basically taxes. It was basically a spreadsheet of now I've been doing it since I was like 10 years old. So to me, it's very second nature. But to someone who's not used to it, you look at this and go, oh my God, I just want to learn how to swing a sword better. So I totally get that. Rollmaster is one of those games, though, that is way more complex on the surface. Like once you get
mhm.
past that initial hump, you go, oh, okay, I get it. This is pretty quick. There's a lot of games that I love that are like that. Hornmaster is probably my favorite game system of all time. But Hornmaster, when you look at it, you go, what is this? This looks like a spreadsheet. This looks like, I don't know what the hell this looks like. How are you supposed to play this? It's unplayable. And that's what I thought the first time I saw it. I just dismissed it. For 20 years, I dismissed it until I came back to it.
Oh
And I
no.
realized that once you sort of grok that initial mechanic, then everything else falls into place. And then it becomes, it becomes the greatest thing ever. But it's a marketing issue at that point. And it's funny because I was with the Columbia Games guys at Gen Con, and we were talking a lot about that
Mhm.
stuff. How do you market a game like that to a group of players who are only used to D&D? And 5e, as you pointed out, is complex enough as it is, but this adds a whole different level of complexity to it, mostly because you are changing your core mechanic. And that screws people up. As soon as you go from a D20 to a percentile system, people go, I don't know what that is. But it's
Yeah, that's
essentially the
tough.
same thing. It's just it's more granular because you have 100 points instead of 20 points, like points you can hit on a die, basically. But I don't know, because I was exposed to so many different systems so young, to me, the idea of switching up core mechanics is very simple. But I can recognize that to people who have only ever played D&D, they have an issue with that. And I think also Baron talked about this in our interview. You know, he said the advantage of something like OSR is people are already used to it if they're coming from D&D. They get the 6 stats, armor class, hit points, class level. They get all that. That's intrinsic. So it's easier to create games that are going to have an immediate audience, right? Like Shadowdark is immediately familiar to D&D players. And also you can borrow supplements and you can borrow adventures from everybody else's games with only a minor amount of tweaking. And I'd never thought of that before. And I was like, oh, that's a really smart thing.
It is a thing. That actually turned out to be kind of a decision point and something that I was aware of when I was designing Shadowdark. I was like, well, am I going to use the core familiar elements of D&D and intentionally have that kind of cross compatibility with a lot of what people were already familiar with and nostalgic about? You know, I had to decide if I was going to try to line up with that or not. And it's really funny that I think, like, as a lifelong D&D player, I'm not even aware of how much I wouldn't get another game if I try to play it. Like, some of the things about D&D are now so built in that it seems automatic to me, and then I try to play a game that doesn't use those same core mechanics, and I'm like, why is this so hard? Like, I've been playing games my whole life, but it's so intrinsic. Like, oh, I don't know, like, I grew up doing things like saying, like, make a save for XYZ, and I can't, it's almost like I can't stop saying that kind of thing, even though saves aren't even in Shadowdark, you know, it's just too built in. So it's really hard. It's hard to move people off of a core system that's become implicit.
Yeah, and even the nomenclature and the terminology is essentially universal. And it's, you know, it's kind of funny when you come across a new game and they have some clever little name for the GM. Well, this is the lore keeper. Yeah, no, it's the DM. We all know what it is, you know. And
I know. I feel like that dooms a game, or it doesn't, like, necessarily, but I feel like that's the sign that a game is cursed if they try to change the name of the game master.
I agree. It's almost, it's a little heartbreaky. You know that term, right? D&D heartbreaker.
Yes.
So for those of you who don't know that term, heartbreaker is a term that I coined. Heartbreaker is a term that used to denote, probably still does denote, I guess, basically some guy's house rules of D&D, but it was the attitude with which he foisted it upon the players and the public. It wasn't just, here's D&D, but I've changed some things. It was, my version is so much superior because I have ablative armor instead of, you know, reducing the ability to hit. So, that's just so much better than that nameless game. And it's like, dude, for real. But it's amazing when you look at even new games that are being kickstarted, that's still out there. Like, that attitude of, like, they're coming up with something no one's ever thought of. And I'm like, dude, we thought of that like 50 years ago, literally 50 years ago. This is nothing new. I don't know. It's so weird because it just exposes the ignorance of that designer that, like, isn't it your job as a designer to at least be aware of what else is going on in the space?
I think so. That it's so true. Like, people, this is one thing I laughed about with Shadowdark. Everybody was like, there's absolutely nothing new about this game. And I was like, yes, I know. Like, there's nothing new under the sun. Like, of course I couldn't. You think I'm going to design a brand new, like, it's one of the things that I see as one of the biggest critiques of it. And I'm always like, well, I wasn't trying to say that anything I did in the game was, like, somehow, like, never before seen. That would be impossible. That would be truly impossible. And even if I didn't, you know, like, there's some mechanics that I couldn't say which game they may have come from, but I know someone did it before me. Like, there's only so many ways you can solve a design problem within a certain framework. So
yeah, exactly. And, you know, I am impressed when I see a new way of doing things that comes, like, for example, the Powered by the Apocalypse engine, which of course comes from Apocalypse World. When that came out, that was a pretty radical departure. I got to give them props for that. And obviously was so successful that all these other designers borrowed it and tweaked it and fine-tuned it and did all that stuff with it. That's really impressive. Or the Blades in the Dark game, right?
Mhm.
That's another example of a system that comes along that really does shake things up in terms of its core mechanics and its approach to the games. Fate, even to an extent, was another one of
Mhm.
those games. But what's interesting to me is that as much as I can appreciate those games, and I've played them all, I still find myself going back to the old percentile based games,
Mhm.
because maybe it's just, 40 odd years of task resolution rather than conflict
Yes.
resolution, right? When I first came across Burning Wheel was really big with this idea of conflict resolution. In other words, if I'm in a situation with someone, I'm going to roll once, and that will determine the result of the conflict. And that includes like a sword fight. And to me, that was so alien and unsatisfying, because to me, a sword fighting, it goes back to what Professor Dionne was saying. It isn't just about the final outcome. It's about the details of how getting there is half the fun. So,
Yes.
so the idea
True.
of task resolution is always something that's more important to me. So when I do see a game that basically says, "Oh no, 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 this is about conflict resolution, not task resolution. You just roll once, and then and you can get on with it," as they say. And I'm like, "Get on with it? You're skipping past the whole fun bit." Anyway, that's just my
Skipping the whole fight scene. That would
skipping
be
the
a
whole fight
crime
scene.
in a movie. Yeah, that's so true. This is so interesting to talk to you about because I feel like, and I'm sure you've heard these words before, but there are sort of different like preference styles of game design, and um, I think more towards the burning wheel side, or like the side where you're resolving things in a really abstract way. It's called abstracting. Like abstracting is a thing that you do when you're trying to simplify a system that doesn't need to be granularly represented. But I think that you're one of the few people who I know who actually is, I would say, much more of a simulationist. Like I think Harn is very trying to inject detail that is much more real world, that like things like D&D gloss over. Like where
Yes.
did you get hit? What kind of injury do you have? And um yeah, I'm always curious like what makes somebody lean in one direction or the other. And I don't know. I think that you might be one of the more simulationist gamers that I know. Have you
100%.
heard people talk about these things?
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, 100%, 100%.
I'm
Really,
sure.
it
Yeah.
comes down to a simple principle. It's what I call roti, which is
Mhm.
not only a Trinidadian dish that's delightful, but but also return on time invested. So what that
Ah,
means is, for the amount of effort I have to put into resolving a situation, what do I get for that effort on the other side? So
mm,
there's two ways of doing that, basically. There's the abstracted way, the Professor Dungeon Master way, right? Like, let's
mhm.
get to the answer as quickly as possible. We'll roll our randomizer, or we'll use our randomizer and get to the answer as quickly as possible. And then there's my way, which is, but I want to know I want the system to alleviate the narrative burden from me. And it's funny because
Hmm.
one of my current players in my vampire game, we get into these philosophical conversations about GMing all the time. And he says, but why would you want to do that? But for me as a GM, I want to be able to, like, that's part of the fun is if you have a more abstract system, then that allows me as a GM to describe more stuff. And I go, ah, that's the opposite of what I want. I want because I spend more of my description on everything else when it comes to like an armed conflict. I want the system to tell me specifically what happens, so then I can riff on that. It's far easier for me to riff on a sword fight in which I know that when the sword strikes you, it hits you in the left foot. That gives me really specific ideas of how to riff narratively on that. And also mechanically, because the system tells me, well, now you're stuck on the foot. Now you got to make a stumble roll. And if you fail, you fall down. And now you're prone. And if you're prone, you're in big trouble because the guy's going to have an advantage to hit you next round. I love that. Ooh, I love it, love it, love it, love it. But an abstracted game says, okay, you hit him and you did 5 hit points damage. There's no real effect because nothing happens until you're at 0. So next, and
Mhm.
I just go, that doesn't tell me anything. The narrative burden is entirely on me at that point to say, okay, well, you hit him under the left armpit and he cries in pain, and it's all irrelevant because the system doesn't reward any of that description. You see what I mean?
Yeah. This is so interesting because I even think so maybe a few years ago even I would have been like, "Oh, well, I want that creative freedom to be able to say like, yeah, you got hit for 5 points of damage. How?" But the reality is that often we won't invest the effort into creating that detail unless
Yes.
there's a reason.
Yes.
And it's kind of funny to think that someone could maybe look at a system like Harn and think, oh, it's so restrictive because it tells you exactly what happens.
Hmm.
But it's built so that it gives you such a wide array of outcomes that it's beyond what you would have improvised in the moment. So really what it is
Right.
it's forcing you to have more variety than you probably would as your baseline, which
Yes.
is kind of an interesting way to look at it.
Yes, bingo. That is exactly right. And it is a lot more effort to generate that outcome. And again, I come back to this return on time invested. So in order for me to get those incredibly detailed, grievous wounds in the left thigh that has very specific, quote unquote, real world consequences in the immediate here and now in the middle of that fight, and also consequences for the character later on, because now they have to heal that leg wound and it might get infected and all that wonderful stuff.
Ooh.
But in order to have that wonderful detail, it requires a lot more input to the system, right? As opposed to roll a d20. And if you hit a target number, you succeed, roll your damage, that's that. It forces a specificity, and to me, I like that, because again, it relieves me of the narrative burden. But I totally understand why people say the opposite. I completely get it, because for a lot of people, especially more casual gamers, speed and simplicity is far more important, because they just want to get through it. Well, we want to get to the next room in the dungeon. We want to kill the next monster. We want to find the new treasure or solve the next puzzle, because, you know, I've only got 2 hours away from the wife and I got to put the kids to bed, so we don't have time. You know what I mean? So I totally get that. Not everybody has the luxury of infinite time like I do to be able to sit back and read all of these, you know, game systems and such. What's interesting is that when we get to the solo aspect of things, which of course, naturally I had to talk about due to the nature of this channel, I thought that a more detail-rich game like Dominion Rules, which is what I used in Season 3, would be really great for the channel, because it would give me all that stuff that I get when I run a game like Harnmaster. What I found in practice was the opposite. What I found was that because it's a show I'm doing, I need to keep the pace up. That means I need to keep the details of the system very, very narrowed and abstracted, because I can't have my audience getting so focused on the weeds of in the weeds of the rules that they lose track of what's going on, because it's a show. It's a show. So
Yeah.
it was just fascinating to me, because I had to break my own rules in Season 3, because it got to the point where when a fight broke out, I was like, you know what? Whoever rolls higher wins. So I was doing everything that I supposedly don't like, right? So there's an argument to be made about both that. But from a design perspective, like if I was to, say, design a game, I would be trying to kind of have it both ways. I'd be trying to give a core system that can be very easily used and abstracted, but at the same time provide kind of like an option where you can dial up those details, which, let's face it, is what a game like GURPS was doing, right? GURPS starts off with a very, very basic core mechanic. It's 3d6 under your skill, done. But as everyone who's ever played GURPS knows, no one stops there, because now you dial it up and you crank up the details, and now you get a situation where we've used so many optional rules that now it takes 3 hours to swing a sword. You know what I mean? So, but I would want to do that anyway. I would still want to have a version of the game to satisfy both the abstract players and the detail-oriented players, but that's obviously a tall order, right?
Well, it is, but it might be one of the few of its kind, right? Because I think like I actually can't think of a time I've read a game system where the designer is saying, here's a lever for abstraction versus simulation. Like usually the designer makes that decision behind the scenes and then just builds the system around it. So, like even fifth edition, I think there are optional rules in the DMG about, you know, ways that you can handle systems differently or add combat wounds or injuries, but they're just so obscure that nobody uses them. Yeah, it would be really, I don't know. I would love to see you design something like that. I feel like you should do it because I want to play it.
Well, we shall see. We shall see. Speaking of solo stuff, you were running a solo game of Shadowdark for your patrons, right? So what happened with that?
Yeah, I'm doing it on YouTube. So this is so funny. Okay, so I did the first episode, proceeded to reverse the math on the mythic chart the entire time because I'm not good at referencing charts. So I was like, I remember when we talked about we had that whole long live stream talking about solo play, and you were saying like mistakes will happen, and I know you hate making mistakes, and I totally do too, but I was like, wow, this has to be probably the most embarrassing basic error to make, but at the same time, I was like, people can learn from my own mistakes here. I'm no pro. So I was doing that, and we have the first episode kind of like we have the setup for how I'm going to start things. And then I was thinking to myself, okay, we're going to move into gameplay. How am I going to represent the gameplay to people in a way that's interesting? And I was like, should I use a VTT? Like, should I draw things on a map and try to have a camera pointing at it so people can see? Because I was like, I think something deserves a little bit more production value than just me sitting there being like, I rolled a 12. That means. So then I went on this like 2-month bender of making terrain that I want to use for it, which is probably just a way of me delaying actually doing the work of recording. But I have a little bit now that'll kind of help me make pretty abstract representations of things, but enough to kind of go on. And then it's this thing my friend Brandon Runehammer Games, who I hope that you'll meet sometime. He talks about the campfire effect with the game, whether the audiences has to have something to kind of look at. Not just when you're sitting around a campfire talking, you're usually not staring at each other's faces. Often you're staring at the campfire, and it's something where you can kind of safely place your eyes that has some change and interest and kind of lets you switch modes a little bit, like listen. And so I'm like, yeah, I would love to have some kind of campfire effect thing for these games where maybe there's something visually cool to look at. And that's why I went on the terrain bender. So
Well, that's certainly that was my philosophy when I started my channel, when I did season 1. I knew that it was a visual medium, and as much as people listen to it, that always drives me nuts because I'm like, so much goes into the visuals, so much of the story is told visually. But I wanted it to be, I didn't have to have super detailed battle maps or anything like that, but I did need to have some sort of visual representation of stuff because it just helps, for me, I like to keep it somewhat abstracted so that it's not so specific that that's the only thing that people can see. You know what I mean? Because you do want to have that balance too, where people are still free to sort of imagine it, their own version of it. Which is tougher to do when you're using actual terrain and stuff. But, I think that's a good call to have that. And that's honestly what a lot of people do with their VTTs as well, right? Like you see a lot of these people, bringing up cool pictures and having sound effects and and stuff like that. Speaking of VTTs, do you do any online gaming VTT stuff?
I do. I run, I actually play in right now 3 groups a week, which is bananas. I went from having no games during like the whole Shadowdark thing to jumping back into several. I run one, and we use the Owlbear Rodeo VTT for that.
Oh yeah,
it's like pretty simple. I like it because it's simple. I'm like, I have a very low threshold for like the amount of technology I can leverage, so that's a good one. And then one of them I'm a player in, we use Roll20, and the game master, who happens to be the guy who runs Runehammer, is like a VTT like wizard, and he's an artist, so he sets up these incredibly beautiful like scenes, and we don't really do like grids or maps, but we have like an image put up that we can kind of, be like, oh, I'm sure that it would make sense for my guy to move this far, given the scene. And he just does such incredible visuals. It's like jaw-dropping. And then the third game is like high school friends. We don't even have a VTT at all. We just talk during.
Oh, like a Discord thing that people do?
Yeah, like once in a while, if we're in a dungeon, the game master will draw on a piece of paper what we see and take a picture of it and like send it to us through a chat.
Right. Super old school.
Yes.
I'm not the hugest proponent of VTTs, but I totally understand their use, and I use them myself. So, but what I've said before is that VTTs create a very different gaming experience than being around the table. But if I had to pick between that and no gaming at all, of course, I would take VTTs.
Yes.
I will say, though, I will sing the praises of VTTs a little bit in that they actually do some things better than you can do at the table. And I don't mean rolling the dice for you. I can't stand that, and I can't stand when a game like Pathfinder on Foundry, when they say things, oh, you don't even have to learn it, you just hit a button. Well, then the VTT is playing the game for you. I'm not interested in that. I actually want to learn how to play the game, but that's just me. But some of the things that I think they do better than what you can do at the table, or at least they do it more efficiently than you can do it at the table, is something like I was running a Forbidden Lands hex crawl a couple of years back on Roll20, and the conceit of that game was they started in one hex and everything else was dark. They did not know anything because it was about exploration. So they knew that there was a whole world out there, but they knew nothing about it. They literally came in across this wall. They knew nothing about this land, and it was go. So every time they would explore a new hex on Roll20, I could literally just reveal the hex. And that is so cool. That is much harder to do on the table. There's ways to do it. When I was involved in a game, a Palladium game that was set in this kind of the Viking world years and years ago, the GMs, and there was two of them, whenever you would travel through the world, they would take a piece of paper, the player's map, and they would literally put it over the DM map, and they would trace the area that you saw in full color, right? So what you see then is you see a player's map with all of these sections surrounded by just white paper, which is the unknown that we haven't explored yet. Super cool. Exact same effect as on the VTT, but infinitely harder to achieve at the table. Way more labor intensive.
Oh
so
my
I think that
gosh.
VTTs do that much better, much easier. Also, it is, you know, it's very easy to grab a photograph of something to sort of say, well, it kind of looks like this, and throw that up there. Although one might say that that's lazy GMing, because of course the job of the GM is to describe, not to say it looks like that. But that again,
I know. That is such an interesting thought. Like I wonder about this because one thing I've run into is at the table, like in the rare chance I get to play in person, it was easier for me when I lived around more of my friends. I've moved far away from everyone I know, but when I lived in New York, I would have groups get together in person to play occasionally, and I actually used to have a lot of Dwarven Forge, so like those
nice.
modular terrain things. And I actually found that they made it really hard to run games, which is like
Yeah.
this is no dig on Dwarven Forge. It's just me being like really fussy or something. But it would take a long time to set up a scene, you know, and then
Yep.
if my players did something off the beaten path, it was just like so obvious that I wasn't expecting or prepared for that it would just ruin the suspension of
Yeah.
disbelief. I'd have to be like, yeah, can we take a 20-minute break while I have to set up like these two dungeon rooms? And it actually became so limiting that I went full throttle in the other direction and stopped using any concrete visuals except like maybe little dice to show where people were standing on a table. I literally, you know, it's like when you get so sick of something that so sick of sweet food, you only eat salty food for 2 weeks. It
Yeah.
was like that kind of effect. So I don't
That
know. Have you, yeah,
I totally get you, man. Like I completely get that, because I feel the exact same way. As much as I love my terrain, I never use it when I'm running an actual in-person game,
right.
because A, it's impossible to transport without destroying it.
This,
The labor involved in transporting it, and then to set it up, you're instantly restricted by only the pieces that you have on hand.
mhm.
So, as you say, if they do something unexpected, when I always love my players to do that, now it's like, well, okay, I guess give me exactly as you say, give me 20 minutes to set up this thing, and maybe I have the right pieces. So I completely hear you on that. For years and years and years, we had a hex grid or a regular grid, like a Chessex battle mat, basically. And
Mhm.
we had water-soluble markers, and we used bingo chips with the character's name on it and an arrow denoting their facing. And that was it. They would go on, and the GM would quickly sketch out the area around them. Now, those sketches could become very detailed. I became obsessed with doing things like, if you're in the forest and you're attacked, I would not just draw it, okay, here's a bunch of trees, here's a campfire. No, it was, here's a fallen log, and I would draw in the wood grain on the log and stuff. But that, you know, that was a tactical obstacle. That was something they could jump over or leap on top of to get an advantage, a height advantage, or stuff like that, right? So it
Yes.
wasn't just masturbation. It was actually, there was a purpose to it.
It
But
mattered.
it was still way faster than plopping down. Even minis. You know, my friend Ross always said that the problem with minis is that, as cool as they are, they really restrict your imagination, because now that's all you see, as opposed to the theater of the mind style, where it's based on the description. As we all know, as any experienced GM knows, the power of the theater of the mind is that everybody has their own version of events, which is awesome. The downside is, tactically speaking, it's very easy to get confused as to where people are. So
Mhm.
in my vampire game that I'm running right now, if there's ever a physical conflict, which does come up, I sketch out on a piece of paper, so very, very quickly, sketch out, this is the car, this is the barrier on the road, the whatever. And maybe if it's super important, I'll put down the bingo chips with their characters. But most of the time, it's just, okay, you're here, you're here, you're here. And if they move, I scratch it out and put their new, like, it's super, super easy. So they're getting the minimum possible physical representation of the conflict, allowing them sort of still to fill in the imagination details themselves. And I think that's a nice balance.
It is. It is. It's funny how, yeah, like going back to our whole discussion on abstraction, I feel like abstraction is very handy as far as like just having just enough to represent the physical space because yeah, like most games, tactical movement matters at least a little bit and
Mm.
but it's so easy to go overboard and actually end up restricting yourself and it's that was a weird lesson to learn and it's been something that I think back now on too when I was a kid and we were playing D&D, we had the Chessex mat. At best, we had like an unpainted pewter mini that we were
Mm.
using to represent ourselves, and then like half the monsters were represented by like D4s. And yet, I still have such vivid memories of the dungeon that I saw in my head. Like
Yeah.
it's like when you read a book, it's like you have these very strong visual memories attached to it that really just came from the description. And I
Yes.
was like, gosh, you don't need you don't need to do a lot of work to really get your players there. It's so much easier, I think, than people think it is
Yeah, and
to
as
do.
I've said a million times, that is the unique power of the RPG, is that
Mhm.
it's creating an experience that is unique to the participants, that only they see, and yet they are also active participants in it. You know, you read a book, you're seeing the author's vision, you're still seeing your vision of it, but it's guided by the author. You have no way to add to that. You're just a passive participant. RPGs, of course, you are actively adding to that evolving scene in your mind as well. And every player around the table has their own version of events. And if I could somehow create a technology where the player's imagination, what they see in their mind's eye, could be projected onto a screen, and to see all the like the 4 or 5 completely different versions of what they're seeing, it would be so fascinating to see, based on a GM's description, what they are seeing. Or maybe it would be fascinating to see the commonalities too, to see what things everyone saw exactly the same. You know, it would be just so cool to
Yeah.
see that.
It would. I love that. And it's yeah, it's funny. So much of this crosses over with creative writing and stuff too. Like there was one really big revelation that I remember I was like reading books about creative writing because at one point I thought I wanted to be a novelist and um this description of this room the author was kind of comparing between just how little you really need to set the scene like you need just so few concrete details and I
Yeah.
remember him describing a kitchen in one example and he over described the kitchen to incredible detail like the tablecloth had this exact checker pattern arranged in such a way and they were each 1 inch and it was like fascinating to see that side by side with a modified version of that sort of hit the bare minimum and how I still got an equally strong visualization from in fact better from the less restrictive one because you need to let your mind fill in the gaps
Yeah.
like you need to participate and if there's so much detail that you don't get to participate in what you're imagining it's like it's impossible to follow it's actually cumbersome so
Yes.
yeah
Yeah.
yeah
There's a famous example from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where, and I think I've said it this before, where C.S. Lewis is talking about the feast that they're having, and he says something like, "There was meats and cheeses and wines and all the things you would imagine at such a feast." And that's it. And you go, "Ah, got it," because now that's a personalized experience of that feast. Now I know I'm seeing my own version of it. And he doesn't have to tell you anything other than that. And you go, "Got it. Good. Moving on." Because it's not relevant to anything else to get those details correct. In a game, you know, there was an infamous situation that happened with me when I was in maybe 8th grade or something, running this D&D game, and we weren't using any battle mats. This was before we used the dry erase stuff. It was all essentially theater of the mind stuff. And at one point, there was this cave that I described as like 150 feet away, and the players were doing something or other, and all of a sudden, this like dire bear comes out of the cave and attacks and rolls to hit. Oh, gets a critical. And one of the players stops and goes, "What has he got, like rubber arms?" And I said, "What?" He said, "He's 150 feet away." And that image of the bear coming out going, and like with his big giant rubber arms, his Mr. Fantastic arms, swatting the player. We laughed and laughed, and it totally wrecked the game. But it was a very valuable lesson. It was like, this is the reason why you do need some level of physical representation, just enough to keep the players all in the same scene together. And ironically, as much as I'm a simulationist games make it almost impossible to have that abstracted theater of the mind style in a lot of cases, because so much of those rules, so much of that ROTI, that return on time invested, is about the specific details of where you are. If I have a spear in Harnmaster and you are 2 hexes away, I have a big advantage on you. But if you come in to 1 hex, now that advantage is lost. You can't really rely on theater of the mind for that kind of stuff, because all of it will be lost in the shuffle. So that's the downside.
Right. Is that something that you kind of like struggle with, or something that you wish was like less of an issue in Harn? Because the Harn has so many benefits, especially for people who really enjoy simulationism. But yeah, I would struggle a lot to so concretely keep track of space and movement. I don't know. Do you have any like hacks or anything that you find like makes that easier for you?
Well, when I was running Harnmaster, the thing that really made it work, A, I knew the system backwards and forwards, so that was good. B, my players also knew the system very well, so that's probably the biggest thing, is you have to have engaged players that are willing to engage and internalize the mechanics, because if you have casual players in a game like that, it's going to be much more difficult. But in terms of the physical representation, that was purely the hex grid and the colored markers, because that is a quick way to produce a very specific physical environment that's hex by hex, which is crucial to that game. If you're talking about a fight, right? Everything else is fine. Everything else can be abstracted. But of course, if you're talking about a physical combat, you absolutely require that. So if you were to take, oh, well, you know, I've got all this great terrain, then you're back with the problem that we talked about before, where now it takes half an hour to set it up, and it's too much. But the markers and the sketch, it doesn't have to be a work of art. It just has to show, here's the walls, here's the obstacles, here's where you are in relation to that person, and this is how many hexes there are in between. That's all it requires. Your imagination will do the rest. But yeah, so it would be colored markers and knowledge of the system. That would be the hack that I would give.
Right. Ooh, is this okay? So I have more weird. This I'm just so interested to hear kind of like how you, because you also of everyone I know, I think you have probably the most broad experience across the spectrums of different kinds of games. Like a lot of people will pick like 3 or 4 that kind of become their maybe not even, maybe less than that, and really focus in on playing those games and collecting the stuff for those games and stuff. But you have a really, really broad level of experience. And so, okay, let's say you were going again to somewhere like Gen Con, and you knew you were going to run games, possibly even with various different systems. What would you bring with you?
Oh boy, who's interviewing who here? Oh.
Well, I want to know. I know. No, it's so interesting. I feel like just getting to talk to you about this kind of stuff is fascinating.
Well, I have been at it a long time. That's true. I have more games in my library than I will ever be able to play, but I've played most of them. Which ones would I bring to do like a one shot? So
yeah, like which games and like what stuff also would you bring with you to support those games? You're like definitely doing an away game. You can't bring everything with you.
Wow. That's tough, because a one shot typically, especially at a con, you've got like 4 hours tops to run a session. So you have to have a game that's immediately accessible. So Harnmaster would be out.
Oh no.
Basically, any of my favorite games would probably be out, because if the goal is to introduce new players to it, then either you have to go with a way rules lighter game, or you have to really laser focus the scenario. So the only way I would do Harnmaster and this would be kind of a disservice to it because it would only be focusing on the combat system. But if I was going to do it, I would bring my battle mat, I would bring my markers, I would bring my little bingo chips with little white stickers on it that I could draw their names on it and put an arrow. I would do that old school, my old school. They would have pre-made characters because, especially in a game like Hardmaster, that could take days just to make the characters for people who don't know. So it would be pre-made characters, and the scenario would be essentially a fight. It would be you're ambushed by bandits on the road. And here's the battle mat, pre-made. I've drawn it all out. Here's the trees and the fallen logs. And here's the overturned cart. And there's the dying horse. And there's the whatever. Here's the contour lines. I always drew contour lines because you need to know elevation.
Ooh, elevation, yeah.
I would draw that, and anything that is important to running the mechanics of that fight is what I would do. That's the only way I'd be able to do it. So if I was doing a Hardmaster, and I'd love to do it, pre-made characters, extremely focused scenario. It's basically one event, boom, to get a flavor of how it works, because that's all you'd have time to do. But if I was running something like, what else would I bring? Oh boy. Oh boy. Oh
Such
boy.
a tricky thing.
That's a good question.
I do not have what to bring perfected, so I'm truly seeking advice with this. No, but like,
I mean, physically dice, obviously I'd bring my big bag of dice. You need all the dice. But what games would I run at a con? I'm tempted to say something like Shadow of the Demon Lord.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's a very, very easy system to learn, and you make characters real quick. It's got enough system meat in it to keep it interesting. I wouldn't call it rules light. I'd call it kind of moving towards rules medium, you know. But it's easy, especially for D&D players, to jump in because it's so similar. It's essentially a variant of 5e, right? I'd probably do that. But I'd have to tack on some of the additional optional rules that were released in some later supplements. Things like, you know, peace armor and stuff like that. I love all that stuff. But yeah, man, I've never run a con game, so I
do you
am
ever
not.
Want to? Do you think you do it, or is it like not? Yeah,
I don't know. I'm sort of weird about running or playing with strangers because. So much of our experience around the table is about the dynamic between the personalities of the humans. And if you're playing with total strangers, God knows where these people are coming from. God knows what they've been into. Like who knows what their focus is or what their foibles are. Who knows about any of that stuff? And I just think anything could derail the experience of that game so quickly if that group of people just does not sort of chemically work together, you know? So I'm even at Gen Con, I had a few opportunities to sit in as a player on games, and I found myself not doing it because of those reasons. I was like unwilling to take the chance. That's probably silly because I'm sure it would have been fine. But there's part of me that goes, no. Only with people I know.
I think I think that is a actually very valid consideration because I've run a lot of con games for strangers, and some have gone really well and some have not. And it really does depend on if the group itself can vibe well together. And, you know, the people playing don't even know who they're going to be playing with. So it really does depend. But I would say it's very rare for something to not really go that well. I think I've had it happen maybe one time where I was almost like, we might just end this game early. Cause it was just like, yeah, we didn't. But part of me was kind of like, should I just like, let these poor people just go get some time back? Like this just isn't working for some reason. So there's always that risk. But yeah, I the more I do that, the more I realize how special it is to have a group of players who you really, really vibe with, because you know, there's just something so magical about understanding your people in the game. It just really is like something you can't really replicate. So,
yeah, and let that be a lesson to you kids. If you find a good group, stick with them, because I've been lucky over the course of my life. My groups have almost universally been awesome. There was one experience where it didn't work, and that was what I'm talking about. It was just a clash of personalities at the table, and also expectations. I had one guy who came in on a World of Darkness game I was doing, who clearly did not want to play that style of game. He was very, very new school, very narrativist, and I, as you can imagine, not so much with that. So that didn't exactly work. That was a little, you know, had to ask him to leave at one point, and that kind of killed the momentum of the game, obviously. But other than that, I've been super lucky. But we did the Mothership game at Gen Con, the YouTuber gang, the whole bunch of us, and that was great. You know,
It was fun. Yeah, we had a blast. I think because, well, at that point I guess we had all hung out a couple times, and I think that that's a group of really easy to get along with people. They have very good people skills, and so
yes.
they were really, you know, and like top tier role players, like Baron Durop. He is so talented and fun as a game master, and I'm just like, can you like run a game for me for like every week for the next year? You know, like he's
Yeah.
so great, and all
Well,
of them are clearly just so top tier at what they do. So
it's funny you say that, because I was talking with Dave Thalmavor about this. We were talking about doing a series of one-shots in game systems that we're interested in, but we know we don't have time to run a full campaign. So wouldn't it be great if like you and me and Baron and Dave, you know, all got together every now and then on the VTT and did a one-shot of one of these systems just to see? I think that'd be hilarious.
I would love that. And, you know, I didn't want to put you on the spot, but I was like, if anyone's going to teach us how to play Harn, which I would love to learn, who better than you? So if you ever want to do that, I mean, again, I know it's probably it's a harder system to pick up, but we all know our games enough,
Well,
you know? So.
if there's any group that could figure that out, it would be these people who literally review game systems on their channel all the time. That would be fairly simple.
Good. That would be fun. They probably like Dave probably already knows everything about Harn. He's going to be teaching all of us about it instead.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
He is like scary smart. Scary smart.
Yes.
When I was interviewing him on the channel, I was just like, oh, I'm not worthy to talk to you about this stuff. You, you know things. You think about things in a way that makes me go, ha, I feel like this guy. Ha ha. So dumb.
Yes.
No brain.
So dumb. I do too. He's so nice though. He's so like mild mannered, and the way that I met him was playing in a game. Like I just like cold came into this game that I got invited into with some people. It was a VTT game. And he was one of the players, and so it's funny when you get to know somebody like entirely outside of who they are and instead as who the character they're playing.
Yeah.
You know? So that's how I got to know him at first, and then but our group got along so well together that I was like, wow, this guy's so cool, and we just became friends after that. So
Yeah.
yep.
Well, we should do that. I'm going to talk to him about that, because I think, you know, if I think people would dig that. I mean, I'd dig it. I'd love it.
I would have a blast. If we're having fun, you've got to imagine hopefully someone watching might be too.
Yeah, hopefully.
Mhm.
Well, I'm going to call this the end of the first of maybe many chats we do, because I could just talk to you for days and days and days about all kinds of stuff. But we're getting up to about an hour or so now, so we've probably bored our listeners and viewers enough for one day. Is there anything you've got going right now you wanted to plug or talk about?
Oh, wow. Just still doing Shadowdark stuff. I'm writing some new zines for it, which are fun. So just like we talked about, I can't help but create new rules for
Mhm.
things. So that's that, you know, next one I'm working on is one that's about overland travel. So keep an eye out for
Where can
that.
people find that stuff?
It'll be either through my Discord server, which is public. So if you just join the Arcane Library, just Google that and it should come up. Or just my website, thearcanelibrary.com. I'll post announcements there with new stuff whenever I have it.
Okay, awesome. Well, always a pleasure.
Thank you, Trevor. You too.
Yeah, so great. And thanks for watching, everybody. And we'll see you next time on Me, Myself, and I.